Welcome, everyone, to Zoom into Books this afternoon. We are going to be talking with multi-award-winning author Joel Burcat. He writes environmental thrillers, and guest interviewer today is Harvey Friedberg. He's a National Critics Circle reviewer and a retired attorney. So, Harvey, take it away.
Hey, thanks, Kathy, and welcome everyone. Joel, it's great to be with you. We've been down this road a few times before with some of your previous books, but it's exciting that you've got a new book out. And congratulations on the publication of your fourth novel. What I'd like you to do to start, if you wouldn't mind, would be to sort of introduce the story of Reap the Wind and perhaps share a short excerpt from the book with the audience.
Yes, Harvey, thank you very much. And let me say, as a starting point, thanks to Kathy Tietz and Headline Books and Zoom into Books for this opportunity. And it's certainly a pleasure being back on Zoom into Books. When we were talking before and I was thinking about it, it occurred to me I've probably been on Zoom into Books about a dozen times. And it's always fun to participate in these virtual programs. So I'm very happy with this book. It's a different kind of a novel than my previous ones. It's about lawyers, which is like my previous books, but this is really more of an action adventure story, kind of the buddy story from hell, if you will. It's effectively, to summarize it very briefly, it's an action adventure story about these three lawyers who get into a car during a climate change induced hurricane, the worst hurricane of the century, and they're driving from Houston, Texas to Cincinnati, Ohio, so that our protagonist, our main character, our hero, Josh Goldberg, can get to Cincinnati where his girlfriend is having their baby. And he's with his best friend, Jeff Roberts, who is another lawyer, but he's an alcoholic and he's drug addicted and he's got some serious problems. And he's also with his boss, Diane Scanlon, who is let's just put it this way. If you worked in a number of places and you had qualities of all of the worst bosses that you ever encountered, that's Diane. And right. She's the boss and she's driving and she's in the back seat of this Lincoln town car as they barrel through Texas and the Midwest on their way up to Cincinnati. So it's a great story. It's a real odyssey. It's a lot of fun, and I hope that I also teach people something along the way about climate change and about and also importantly about what is in the minds of young lawyers as they are moving through the ranks at these major law firms. Mm-hmm. So I'm happy to read a little bit from my book. After about a minute of driving slowly, the bridge loomed ahead. It was one of those flat highway bridges, unimpressive. It was not the kind with towers and suspension cables, just a flat top. On an ordinary day, you'd cross it in a few seconds and not know you'd been on a bridge. Another rain-coated sheriff held up his hand and stopped me. He was also wearing clear ski goggles. You the one who talked to Deputy Elias at the back of the line? Yes, sir. Is it better that I take this fast or slow? The cop shook his head. It's better for y'all to wait a spell. If you're bound and determined to take it, though, I take it slow, real slow. This ain't no rodeo. Be prepared for hard wind that'll look to blow you right off the bridge, close back to Galveston. Even in this big car, just be prepared for it. He looked toward the bridge and waited for the wind to calm a bit. Then he said, okay, partner, you're up, like in a rodeo. I was the one sitting on the angry bull with its balls bound up. I thanked him and rolled up the window. I drove about 20 miles per hour. When we reached the opening for the bridge, the winds, which were already roaring, picked up, and the car rocked violently. The bridge wasn't long, maybe a quarter mile, flat, cement, 4 lanes with a divider, and a rail on each side at about waist height. A red sign with big white letters at the entrance to the bridge read, Trinity River, warning, dangerous winds. The sign was whipping back and forth like it wanted to unscrew from the ground and fly off. I was sorely tempted to step on the gas and rocket across this damn bridge. I started venturing across tentatively, going maybe 10 miles per hour. When I was a few dozen feet across, the wind picked up even more and the car began to rock. I mean serious rocking. I glanced at Jeff. He was holding the above head grip with one hand and had his other hand on the dashboard. I glanced in the rear view. Diane had put her work down and had her hands on the seat to brace herself. I tapped the gas and sped up to 30. The rocking eased a bit. When we were about halfway across, a big gust coming downstream hit us from the side. The car began to go up on two wheels. The front and back wheels on my side felt like they weren't gripping the deck. The wind was like a giant fist, pushing us off the bridge onto the narrow shoulder. As my wheels were pushed, the noise from the concrete corduroy strip on the shoulder warned me of the approaching edge of the bridge. The car felt like it was going to roll onto its roof and over the river. "The hell with it," Jeff shouted over the wind. "Get off the damn bridge."
Okay, thanks, Joel. As I read the novel, it occurred to me that the premise, three lawyers in a car in a hurricane, might be the start of a bad lawyer joke. But this is a very serious book, a very dramatic book. It does have some lighter moments, but it deals, as you said, with the subject of climate change. And I know you were in practice as an environmental lawyer for many years, and your previous novels have dealt with issues like fracking and illegal dumping and coal mining. But I didn't think of climate change per se as an issue that you would have dealt with as a practicing lawyer. What was it that interested you in this subject, and how did you go about doing the research that you've incorporated into the novel?
I'm glad you asked that question. Climate change, of course, is the existential issue of our time, and it is a really important issue for all of us to be mindful of. You don't deal with it directly in the practice of law, in the practice of environmental law. Where you deal with it would be in air pollution requirements and in gas and oil drilling and in other things where there might be some air discharge. But it's not like most lawyers who practice environmental law have a climate change practice. Some do, but it really is an air pollution practice more than anything else. It's been something certainly that I've been following for the past 30 years and reading a lot about over the years. And I was waiting for the right idea to pop into my mind as to how to discuss climate change. So, as in my previous books, I like to present a particular issue and then have that issue in the book as something that I can educate while we're having a fun read.
Mm-hmm. And I noticed that someone who read and commented on your book was Michael Mann, who was a very well-known climate scientist. I believe he is or was at Penn State.
Yes.
Is he someone that you spoke to about the novel and the research that you were doing for the novel?
I did, and I had the opportunity to meet him personally at the Midtown Scholar bookstore in Harrisburg when he was doing a book signing a number of months ago. And I had watched him on a number of different live programs over the years. I've read a couple of his books. He was at Penn State, and now he's the chairman of a program at the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia. So he hasn't moved that far across Pennsylvania. He's really a distinguished person and probably the best known climate change scientist in the United States, and certainly one of the leading climate change scientists in the U.S. We did talk a bit about it, and he was excited about the idea of a book that, through fiction, would discuss climate change, because although his books tend to be very approachable and very readable, you can imagine that most of the books that deal with climate change, deal with some very heady scientific things, and they're not necessarily that easy to read. His books, he writes interesting and good books that are readable, but he was excited about the idea of a book that would present this in fiction. So I sent him a copy of the manuscript, and maybe 3 or 4 weeks later, he sent me a nice blurb about my book, which we've been using to promote the book. So it was very nice meeting him and very kind of him to read and then comment on my book.
One of the things I thought that was interesting in the way you presented this issue was you sort of give an opportunity for a couple of characters, Diane being one of them, to take the opposite point of view, shall we say. What was your thinking in doing that?
In all of my books, I try to present both sides of the issue, and it's always a question trying to figure out who's the right person to present, these other perspectives. Unfortunately, climate change has become a political and politicized issue, so that when you look at the statistics, as I did not too long ago, you see that about 90% of Democrats, let me use this term, believe in climate change, and about 55% of Republicans don't believe in climate change, whatever that means. So it has become a politicized issue, sadly, because it shouldn't be. It's a scientific issue, and it's been studied extensively, and studied not just by some Birkenstock wearing scientists, but it's studied by scientists across the globe. It's studied by many different specialties, and it really shouldn't be a political issue. So I do try to present the other side to the extent that there is another side. It's interesting. I was being interviewed on NPR's affiliate in Harrisburg not too long ago, and Scott Lamar, who you may know, was the interviewer, and he said, "Well, I can't imagine that there is another side to the issue." I said, the fact of the matter is that generally speaking, there's two sides to every issue. And certainly in this case, there are many people who either don't believe that there's a thing called climate change, or they don't want to believe that it's man-made, or they don't want to believe that it has to do with fossil fuel, or they don't believe it's as serious as the climate change advocates are saying it is. But it's a serious issue. And so Diane seemed like a natural as a person to present the issue. And then there are, the story starts in Houston, Texas. And so there's some gas and oil industry people there, and they also don't really have the same view as Josh does and some of the others in the story do. So they also present some of the other side. And then you've got Jeff, who is a real estate lawyer, and nothing negative about my real estate law friends. I've got a lot of friends who practice real estate law, but I present him as sort of a neutral person with an open mind, and he's asking a lot of questions about it.
So what's the challenge to you as a novelist in presenting this information in a work of fiction? I've read novels where the writer sort of stops in the middle of the story and dumps a lot of information on the reader, and it really doesn't work as fiction. And I think you've overcome that challenge. And how did you do that in this novel?
I'll tell you, you're right about that. There are some writers who do an info dump, as we call it, and other writers who have managed to do it brilliantly. When you think about it, Michael Crichton, who wrote a book called Jurassic Park, taught us an awful lot about genetics and dinosaurs and other things that are studied by stuffy old scientists in lab coats and in college campuses. But he made it exciting and interesting, and you didn't even know that you were learning about genetics. You didn't know that you were learning about paleontology when you were reading that book. And he wrote a number of books. He was a medical doctor. He wrote a number of books dealing with medicine and dealing with climate change also. And he really managed to weave into the story the science, so that you almost didn't know that you were learning something as the story was going along. Another one who did it brilliantly was Tom Clancy. And Tom took a subject that could have been really boring, nuclear submarines, and he managed to make that into something that was not just interesting, but sold something in the neighborhood of 5 million copies of his book, The Hunt for Red October. Mm-hmm. It was made into a major film with Sean Connery, I believe. But he weaved into that all kinds of information about science and about sonar and radar and all that other stuff. And you didn't even know till the end of the story that you learned an awful lot. And so writers like that and a number of other writers have managed to weave into their stories in a way that we don't even realize that we're learning. And so from those writers and from others, I was inspired to try to write books that would do the same thing.
Yeah. So there's another aspect to the novel that you alluded to, and that is the story of these lawyers, all of whom work for a big firm based in Philadelphia. And I found that a particular interest because, like you, I practiced law for many years, not with a huge firm, with a good size law firm. So I certainly could recognize a lot of what you were writing about. And I think that part of your story will be of interest to readers who maybe want to see the curtain pulled back a little bit on these big law firms. I mean, we can turn on the TV every day. We see lawyers. We see lots of cases that are being talked about that are in the news, and we see these lawyers who are involved in handling these cases. So I think it'll be interesting to people to get an insight into how these firms work. There are a couple of aspects to that. One is the story of Josh and Jeff, who are sort of close to grabbing the brass ring of partnership. I guess Jeff's a little bit closer than Josh is, but they've worked quite hard for 7 or 8 years or more to get to this, and they're on the brink of it. But there's a lot of ambivalence about grabbing that, trying to grab the last reach for that brass ring. I've heard it described as winning a pie eating contest where the first prize is more pie. So how much of your experience practicing law is in this book? I know you're not Josh or Jeff, but you obviously drew on that experience to make this a realistic portrait of what life is like for lawyers in these big firms. So talk about that a little bit.
Sure. One of the things I really like to do in my stories is to take my readers to places where they haven't been. And whether you are, just a reader who's reading for pleasure or somebody who's not a lawyer, you haven't been inside of, the close confines of a large law firm. And I did that in my first book when I took readers to a dump site and to a deep mine, and my second book when I took them to a strip mine, and my third book when I took them to a fracking site. And here I've taken you basically inside the minds and close conversations of real life lawyers. By the way, all of my lawyers went to law school and passed the bar exam, unlike in suits. So it's different in that regard. But the one thing I really wanted to do was to take a very deep dive into what are the conversations and what are the thoughts that are in the minds of these young lawyers, because Josh and Jeff are in their early 30s. As you pointed out, they've been practicing for 7 or 8 or 9 years. They're very close. Jeff is really close to possibly becoming a partner, although he's been given sort of the thumbs down. He already knows he's getting the thumbs down and he's not going to become a partner. And Josh, on the other hand, has a very good chance at becoming a partner. That brass ring is within his grasp. But I really wanted the readers to understand what's actually going on in the minds of these lawyers. We learn, for example, that Jeff, from the moment he decided to become a lawyer in a private firm, always wanted to be a partner. He's perhaps being given the opportunity to be something else. Sometimes the term is called counsel or of counsel in a law firm. And he explains to Josh how that was just never part of his mindset. He didn't go to law school to become of counsel to a law firm. And so he's struggling with that because in his mind, this is the thing that was clearly very important to him. Josh is different. Josh got out and he was very idealistic and an environmentalist, and he goes to work for a big law firm that represents, industry and represents a lot of industrial operations and fracking operations and all the rest of that. And he is drawn into this lifestyle. He's drawn into the fancy dinners. He's drawn into the $200 bottles of wine. He's drawn into the lifestyle and the gigantic, really ridiculously large paychecks. And he's just drawn into it. And before he realizes it, he feels completely trapped by it. And to a certain extent, as he says at some point to Jeff, he says, I really almost didn't have a choice. He said, I had these gigantic loans of in the neighborhood of $400,000 that I had to pay off. He said, I couldn't just go off and work for a government agency or work for a private environmental group. He said, I needed to pay off these loans. So I felt like as though I was trapped. So he's now kind of regretting a lot of things, but he's thinking aloud, and we're invited into his head to see what is it that's troubling him, and see how he works that out, and how he and Jeff, who play off of each other, are working out these issues.
As you described, the rewards, which can be quite generous, come at a pretty high price. When you're talking about people who are required to bill well in excess of 2,000 hours a year, they're working 60, 70 hours a week or more, pursuing something that may never come to pass for them. So it's a difficult trade-off. I certainly for Josh as a character, and you do a good job, as you say, getting inside his head, explaining how that trade-off works. And I think you've also highlighted a really interesting ethical issue that these lawyers are facing. There's a scene in which Josh is describing how he gives advice to clients, and the advice is always strictly in accordance with the law, with his ethical obligations as a lawyer. But at the same time, he understands that they're taking that advice, and in the case of climate change, they may be acting on it in a way that's harmful to the client. And that becomes sort of an ethical dilemma for him, as you described that. So did you have those kinds of experiences in your practice, and how do you portray that in the book?
I think all lawyers, environmental lawyers, are faced with challenges on a daily basis, especially in private practice, where clients come to you and they basically, I'm going to say 99.9% of my clients came to me and they wanted to comply with the law, not a scintilla more than what the law required. So if there was a bright line, they wanted to go right up to the edge of that line, and they were willing to stop at that point. But they didn't want to go, they didn't want to leave anything on the table, so to speak. They really wanted to be able to do whatever it was that they were required to do. Lawyers give advice. It's not, generally speaking, it's not the lawyer who's running the show. Generally speaking, the lawyer is simply giving advice to clients. And so the lawyers would give the advice to the clients, and then the client does what they're going to do. And like I said, in most instances, my experience was that the clients listened to what the lawyers had to say. Not in all instances, but in most they did. And it was challenging at times, because it might be different than what your personal views were. In my mind, so long as I was giving legal advice, solid legal advice, and so long as I was behaving ethically, I felt like I was doing the right thing. And at times, I was always very careful to make sure that the client wasn't using me. There were one or two instances in my career where I felt as though the client, in fact, was abusing my legal advice or wasn't listening to me. And I will tell you that I did, as we like to say, fire those clients, because I wasn't going to be drawn into something, and I certainly didn't want to become part of their scheme, whatever that was. And so I did fire a few clients. But when you see about these massive incidents, these awful situations, these railroad cars, tumbling over and causing destruction, as it did in East Palestine in Ohio, or large fuel tanks bursting and polluting a river. Most of the time, that's absolutely not what that company wanted to have happen. Mm-hmm. They didn't want, I guarantee you that Norfolk Southern didn't want those train cars to overturn and cause that problem. And I guarantee you that any company that's had a spill didn't want that spill to happen. So very often what we find is that there's negligence. There may even be gross negligence, but for the most part, there's not intentional activity. Now, there are instances where that happens. face it and be honest with ourselves here. There are times when companies do things that are intentional. Robert Dugoni, the great thriller writer, has a book out called what do you call it? The Canary in the Coal Mine, or something like that. And it's one of his first books. And he describes an instance where workers were sent inside a large containment vessel to clean it out. And the vessel had been used to hold arsenic-laced stuff. And that's actually not a fiction story. It's a nonfiction story written like a thriller. So there are times when companies do things that are intentionally bad, and they deserve what's coming to them. But for the most part, I found that most clients had terrible accidents. There may have been some lack of planning on their part. There may have been negligence or carelessness. But if you think about it, did Norfolk Southern really want to have to deal with what happened in East Palestine? What they did was a tragedy for the people who live there. I'm not concerned at all for them, but for the people who live in that area, it's a terrible tragedy, and they're going to be suffering for that for decades and maybe even generations. But in any event, I doubt that company intended that to happen.
Yeah, and there are people who say that the term legal ethics is an oxymoron, but lawyers who practice with integrity and want to follow the code of professional conduct that governs our profession certainly have an obligation not to advise clients in a way to do things that will be fraudulent or criminal. But at the same time, we have an obligation to help the client realize their objectives. And that may achieve something that personally we might not agree with in terms of the result that's going to come about, but we have an obligation to tell them what the law is and to help them realize what they want to do within the bounds of the law. And I think you've sort of framed that dilemma in this story in describing how Josh operates in advising his environmental law clients. One of the things that I think really stands out about this book is that your characters have a depth to them that you don't necessarily see in a lot of thrillers. Why is it important to you to create characters that are going to be multidimensional rather than sort of characters that are carrying a particular flag in a story but are perhaps not fully realized?
I've read a lot of really, really good thriller fiction where I felt the characters, especially the main character, was, flat, like a cartoon on a page, and doing exciting things, doing interesting things, maybe even having some skills that the rest of us don't have. And I'm always left unsatisfied by those stories. And I've been, if I can get and talk about nerdy writing things here for a second, there's a point of view known as deep point of view. And deep point of view requires the writer to really dive very, very deeply into the mind of the character. And that's something I tried to do in this story, especially for Josh and Jeff, and also for the person we're not talking about yet, Keisha. I tried to get into their minds as much as I possibly could and dive down and really plumb what these folks were thinking about and what was motivating them and what was really behind their actions. And so that, as we all know, we say things, but at the same time, in the back of our minds, we're thinking something that might be different than what we're saying, or maybe we may be modifying what's coming out of our mouths. And despite the fact that inside of our heads, there's something else going on. And I tried to do that with these characters, was to give you an insight into both what they're saying and what they're thinking, because I prefer reading about characters who are multidimensional. I like, and I think that my readers want to read about real people, and they want to really understand, especially in this instance where most people are not lawyers in, as somebody, as one of my reviewers called it, in tall building law firms. Most folks are not like that. And so I wanted to give them a sense of what some lawyers in those firms are thinking.
Mhm. You mentioned Keisha. We don't want to neglect her. So why don't you talk a little bit about who she is and what her role in the story is?
Keisha is Josh's girlfriend. They're not married, but she's 8 months pregnant. And the story begins in Houston, Texas, in the midst of this awful hurricane. She decides that she needs to go back home to Philadelphia, where her mother and her obstetrician are located. And she wants to get back there so that she can be with them. And so Josh, unfortunately, has to stay. His firm is putting on a program. And the next morning, he's the person who's chairing the segment of the program. He's got to stay. He feels terrible about it. She decides she's going to go. Her flight gets diverted to Cincinnati, and she's in a hospital in Cincinnati after she passes out in the ladies' room in the airport. And she's a very confused young woman. She's about 30 years old. She's still very confused about what she wants in life. She's got this baby that she's about to give birth to, but she's still confused. And in her hospital room, in walks Anthony Suter, her new obstetrician, who was the love of her life 7 years earlier when she was in Philly as a younger woman. And
I'm glad you revealed that because I was careful not to reveal any spoilers, but you're the author, so
Oh,
go
well,
ahead.
I'm not revealing any spoilers. This is the beginning of the book still. So
Right.
Anthony Suter walks into her hospital room, and he's her doctor. And he is, he has been, as they used to say a long time ago, he's still carrying a torch for her. He still has feelings for her. And a big part of the story is what's going on with Keisha and Anthony, as Anthony is trying to win her back. And Josh, who's perceptive and reads the text messages from Keisha, realizes that that's yet another motivating factor. He wants to be with her if she's going to have the baby, that's for sure. But yet another motivating factor for him to drive through this hurricane to get to Cincinnati is to be there and put himself between Keisha and Anthony.
Right. And so she's one of the two main female characters, and you have two principal male characters. Do you have a preference writing from the perspective of a male character or female character?
Well, it's a lot easier for me writing, obviously, for male characters, but I try very much to be as empathetic as I possibly can when I'm writing for a female character, and try to base my writing on, obviously, like all of us, having many conversations with women. I have two daughters and my wife, and trying to understand the issues that are important to them. I try to read as much as I can about women's issues, and so I'm not, I can't say that I write perfectly about women characters, but I'll tell you what, an exercise that I've done for myself is I've written a whole novel, first person from a female character's point of view, that has not been published yet. But it's something that I feel is important. I am a person who believes that if you are empathetic, if you do a lot of studying, if you are willing to share your writing with people of whatever quality that is, and listen to what they have to say about it, that a man can write for a woman, for example, or a woman can write for a man, conversely.
Mm-hmm. I just want to remind everyone, if you have any questions, please put them in the chat, and we'll turn to those at the end of this conversation. The novel is, as we've talked about, is a really great blend of character-driven fiction and action scenes. Do you have a preference in your writing? Would you rather write those action scenes? There's a great scene involving a tornado, and I won't say anything more about it than that. But if you've seen any of these tornado chasing movies, I think you'll particularly enjoy that scene. But there are also many quieter scenes between and among these characters. Do you have a preference in writing this novel?
It's a good question. I liked writing both kinds of scenes. And as you point out, there's a tornado scene. In fact, you can see over my shoulder a picture that we used on the cover of the book with a tornado and lightning. There's a hail scene, there's rain scenes, there's hurricane scenes. I mean, this is a real action film. I mean, there's no doubt about it. There's a lot of action and adventure going on in this story. And I had a lot of fun writing those scenes, but they're hard to write too. First of all, they require a lot of research, and it's not merely enough to have watched The Wizard of Oz and think that you can write a scene about a tornado, or that you've watched, a lot of other movies. But I did a fair amount of research into meteorology and climatology and other related subjects, both books and internet searches and the like. And it was important for me to get the facts right in this story. So that part is both fun and difficult, because you want to get the facts right. You don't want to just rehash what other people have done. Mm-hmm. But it was fun. I mean, look, there's no doubt about it. Writing a scene about a Lincoln town car driving into a tornado is kind of fun for a lawyer or for a writer to be able to write that kind of thing. Yeah. And then writing the scenes about the individuals, I love that. I mean, that's just fun. I mean, there are a bunch of scenes with Diane where, again, imagining the worst boss ever, all your worst bosses, all of the worst bosses' qualities balled up into one person, Diane, and being able to write for her and the things that she does, and just how awful and mean she is at times and manipulative. I mean, that was also fun to write those interactions. The conversations between Jeff and Josh in particular, where both of them get an opportunity to really explain to us as readers what's going on in the heads of these young lawyers. I mean, that was also fun to do. I mean, I have to say, for both kinds of scenes, it's fun for me to write that. Difficult in different ways, and challenging also in different ways.
Yeah, well, I'll just say about Diane, she is, as a former firm ethics lawyer, I will say that Diane is a firm ethics lawyer's worst nightmare, and I'll just leave it at that. She's quite a strong character, as you've described her, and not necessarily in a good way. I'll just leave it at that. So I'd like to turn just for the last few minutes of our conversation, and we do have a couple of questions I want to get to, more to some writing process questions. So you've written now 4 novels since 2019, published 4 novels. I know you've written some that have not yet been published. What have you learned about the process of writing a novel, and what advice would you give to a writer who may be working on his or her first novel and anxious to get that published?
The main piece of advice I can give to anybody who wants to write is, it's very simple. It's one word: write. Sit down and write. I've talked to quite a few people, especially since my first novel came out, Drink to Every Beast, and they say, "Oh, I've got this great idea, and I have got all this in my head here, and I just want to someday I have to put it on paper." Just put it on paper. I mean, you just have to start writing, and don't worry about what your first draft is going to look like. Just start writing and start putting it on paper, and don't worry about what your first draft is going to look like. Stephen King has written a great book called On Writing. And there's some other great books about writing, and all these great books about writing, talk about your crappy first draft, that it's not going to be good, but don't worry about it. The important thing is to get it down on paper. The other thing too is something that I shouldn't have to tell people, but I feel I have to, and that is that if you're going to write thrillers, you should be reading thrillers. If you're going to write a romance, you should be reading romances. If you're going to write literature, you should be reading literature. I mean, all of these things, it's not just that you have I've got a great idea in my head, I'm going to write a legal thriller. But you've never read a legal thriller. I mean, you have to read Grisham. You have to read Truro. You have to read Scottolini. You have to read all of these people who've come before you and who've written some really excellent books, so that you get a sense of what works and what doesn't work. People like Grisham, who right out of the gate wrote a great novel, when you read some of the earlier stuff today, you realize that he's not nearly as strong back then as he is today. So it's very important for people who want to write to both write and to read.
It always surprised me when I would talk to people who were aspiring writers, and I would specifically ask them, well, who do you like to read? What kind of books? And when they would answer, well, I'm not really a reader. I once heard a writer say, imagine that you were talking to someone who wanted to start a band, played a guitar or played an instrument and wanted to start a rock band. If you ask them, who do you like to listen to? They would name 100 bands whose music they listen to, and they've listened to thousands of songs, and yet somehow there are people who think that they can write books without being readers. And that always puzzled me. And then there was a person, as you said, who would come up to you and say, oh, I've got this great idea. I just need somebody to write it for me. As if there are writers waiting to translate other people's ideas into books. They have their own ideas. They're not looking for people to give them ideas to write about. You had a recurring character in your first 3 novels, and he gets a mention in this book, a passing mention. I won't say anything more than that. His name is Mike Jacobs, and he was a lawyer for the Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection. Was there a reason why you moved away from that series of books, and do you have any intention to go back to Mike and his work?
I loved writing about Mike Jacobs, and I had a great time writing about him. And I think when I wrote the first book, Drink to Every Beast, published by our friends at Headline Books, my intention really was to write a 3-book series, although I could have gone on and written many more books about him. But from Drink to Every Beast to Mid-Rage to the final book in that series, there's sort of an arc of the story, so that by the time you get to Strange Fire, the 3rd book, Mike you've seen Mike as a sort of a callous young lawyer who doesn't really think about either what he does as a lawyer or what he does as a human being, to a Mid-Rage where he's learning a lot of things about himself and learning how to be a better lawyer, to finally Strange Fire, where he's sort of gone full circle, and now he's a mensch, he's a good man, and he's also a really good lawyer. And I could have kept writing about him, but I felt as though it was time to have him stand aside, and I had some other characters I wanted to write about, so that Josh Goldberg is a different kind of lawyer. I'll tell you, I'm writing another book right now. My main character is a lawyer named Bobby Beck, and Bobby is also an environmental lawyer. I seem to keep coming back to these environmental lawyers, covered in tattoos, loves to play the electric guitar, and as he says to another character in the story, he said, if I weren't a lawyer, he said, I'd be a lead guitarist in a rock band. So he's a very different kind of character as well. So I like exploring these different people because, for as many people as there are, we're all different and we all have different characteristics and qualities. And I like exploring people who are pushed into doing things that they may not otherwise have done, and then seeing how they react. So I love writing Mike. Maybe I'll come back to Mike at some point. But right now, as I like to say, he's been on a sort of an extended vacation.
So Kathy had a question, and that is, have you written any books in other genres outside what we'll broadly call the legal thriller genre?
In fact, I have. I finished one very recently called Bullets Over Broad Street, which is a complete crime thriller. It's about the Irish mob in Philadelphia in the early 1970s. No mention of environmental law, no mention of lawyers, except, I'm calling my lawyer kind of thing. And that's totally different. And I enjoyed writing that book very much. I've written a book, interestingly, when COVID began and we're all locked in and locked down, I wrote a book that is called Lullabies and Other Lies, which ended up being a young adult thriller. The premise is all of the adults have been killed off by a pandemic, and the only people left alive are teenagers. And so there's a kind of a Lord of the Flies feel to it. It's a very dark story. It's Lord of the Flies meets The Road. So you take 2 dark books and you just sort of smush them together, and that's Lullabies and Other Lies.
Yeah.
And even the title hints at something about the story. So I loved writing that story. And by the way, before I read that or wrote that, I read about a half a dozen young adult books. And I realized when I started to write the book, I hadn't made it all that dark. After I read these books, I thought, I can make these stories as dark as I want, because the stories that young adults are reading, meaning 13 to 17-year-olds, some of them are very, very dark. And so I've written that. I've written a book called Little Brother, which is about a township that goes to war with the FBI. So I've written some other things. Those books are currently on the desk of my agent. So we're in the process of shopping those books around, as they say.
And there was one other one about the 1950 Phillies, wasn't there?
Yes, actually, I've written that book and rewritten that several times. It's a story set entirely in 1950, right. And it's very much about the 1950 Phillies. I'm a Philadelphian. I grew up in Philly. I'm enamored with the Phillies, and it's about a young man who is a Navy veteran and war hero, and he is being pressed by his family to go work for his best friend's advertising agency, when in reality what he wants to do is to become a novelist himself. And so it's a story about being pressured to do what you don't want to do. Meanwhile, the backdrop of that story is the 1950 Phillies, and I had great fun with that because I got a chance to really research the 1950 Phillies very deeply, and that story has from the beginning to the end the 1950 Phillies in it. So it's about both things. It's both about the 1950 Phillies and about this young man's struggle to try to do what he feels is right.
Can you work on more than one book at a time, or do you find once you're working on a project that you have to devote all of your attention to that?
I basically work on one book at a time, and when the book is finally written, I often will be editing it as I'm starting another book. So I'm still editing Bullets Over Broad Street. That's the one about the Irish mob in 1973 in Philadelphia. I'm basically done with that. Now I'm doing some edits on it while I'm writing The Firebrand, which is the one with Bobby Beck in it, the guy who, if he wasn't a lawyer, would have been lead guitarist in a rock band. Mm-hmm. So I can do that. I can't write two books at the same time, though.
Mm-hmm. And how long does it take you from the time you start with the blank first page until you've got let's say a finished product, not necessarily a first draft, but it's been through multiple drafts and you say, okay, this is something that I think is publishable. What's been the time frame for that for you?
From the fastest I've ever written a novel that is now published was Strange Fire, my third novel. That took me 7 weeks from start to finish to write the basic story. Mm-hmm. And then I took the rest of the year rewriting the story, editing it. It ended up being about 100,000 word story. So I wrote 70,000 words really in those 7 weeks, but it was the whole story was there. And one of the things that most people probably don't realize who aren't writers is that we writers spend a tremendous amount of time editing and rewriting our stories. So it's been said often that writing is rewriting. And so you just have to, I can't even begin to tell you how many times I've read my own stories, because I read them and I reread them and I go over them so many times and change them up and edit them. And I have a critique group that I'm a member of, and they go over it and they give me very helpful critiques. I have an editor that goes over my stories, and he comes back with, after I think the story is done and clean and perfect, he comes back with hundreds of edits things that I just never saw.
Yeah. Well, I was going to ask you that question. That was another question that we had in the chat. Do you show your work to other people, and how valuable a part of the process is that?
Absolutely. I know I've talked to some writers who say they don't like to show their work until the work is done. I don't know how you can do that. There are things you just miss, and there are things that you become enamored with that you don't realize that the rest of the world thinks is not great. It's boring, it's slow. And so I'm going to say virtually every successful writer I've ever talked to, now I'm going to say every successful writer I've ever talked to shares his stuff with other readers. And in fact, I know one writer who, when he gives a copy of his book to people to read, is what's known as his beta readers. He also gives them a highlighter. And he says, when you get to the boring parts, I want you to highlight those for me.
Right.
And so, if there's a boring part that's highlighted, when he gets the book back from the reader, he knows he's got to either change that or just cut it out. He says, if there's a part of the book that you skim over that you don't want to read because it's just, it's just not interesting to you, let me know about that. So he's able to eliminate those parts of the book or change them up. So my wife reads the very, very first draft. She's my alpha reader. Then I have my critique group, which is reading this. Sometimes I'm just a few chapters ahead of them. My critique group will read that. And then there's an editor who might read the book. There's I have several close friends of mine who will get a preliminary copy of the book to read. And they will take a look at it and they'll report back to me on sort of the overarching aspects of the book. I like this character, or this character is awful, or you've got to do something about this, or this is not believable, and stuff like that. Not line edits, anything like that, but they're trying to help me out and make the story as good as it possibly can be. So by the time my book even gets to the publisher, it's probably been read by easily 10 or 15 people.
Your comment about the highlighter reminded me of Elmore Leonard, who came up with a list of rules for writers. If you Google that, you'll find it. They're very pithy, like Elmore Leonard's writing. And one of them is, I leave out the parts that people skip.
Right.
So when you see the yellow highlighting, that he would probably take a delete, hit the delete button there. Yeah. Well, we're getting close to the end of the hour, but before we close, I wanted to ask you, is there anything else you would like to say about Reap the Wind that you don't think that we touched on in this conversation?
Yes, and that is, in the marketing materials, we refer to it as an Odyssey. And as you're reading through the book, understand that one of the things that I very intentionally did as I was writing this story was to draw parallels to Homer's The Odyssey. And if you're a careful reader, you will find lots of references to Homer's The Odyssey. I will give you two, and then you can look for the dozens of others that are in the story. So Keisha's former boyfriend, her current obstetrician, is named Anthony Suter. If you have read The Odyssey, you will know that the suitor of Penelope, who was Odysseus's wife, is named Antinous, and he was a suitor. So he is Anthony Suter, and that's a little reference to the book. It's what we writers might call an Easter egg. There's another one that I'll give away, and that is there's a one-eyed character in my story. He wears a patch like a pirate, and his name is Pauly. So he is I based him on the Cyclops in the Odyssey, whose name in the Odyssey was Polyphemus. So I call him Pauly. So there are many other references to the Odyssey, and one of the things that you should be doing as you're reading the story is trying to find those little nuggets that I've left for you. At some point, I'm going to have a contest, and I'm going to see if people can find, whoever gets the most will get some great prize, maybe a gift certificate to something. But in any event, so that's something that you ought to be looking for as you're reading this Odyssey that I wrote.
Okay. And do you want to let folks know where they can purchase the book and also where they can find more information about you and your work?
Yes. I think Kathy was kind enough to put my contact information in the chat, but you can just look me up at joelburcat.com and you'll find information about me. You'll find references to the book. You'll find references to how to get the book. The book, of course, is available at Amazon, both in Kindle and in paperback. It's available at bookstores, and it should be generally available. If it's not in your bookstore, they can order it through their usual channels. So the book is very available. If you want a signed copy of the book, there's a bookstore here in Harrisburg called Midtown Scholar, and they have a very nice website. And if you go to their website and type my name in, you'll see how you can order a signed copy of my book. So you can have that for your collection of, you put mine next to Grisham's book that we had signed.
Okay. Well, with that, I think we'll wrap it up. Joel, it's been really, really fun talking with you again. I wish you the best of luck with the book and with the future novels that I know are going to be coming from your computer. So thanks very much.
Well, Harvey, thank you. I really appreciate it. You and I have done this a few times, and I enjoy our conversations. And thanks especially to Kathy Teets and the people at Headline Books for doing this Zoom into Books program. And let me just say that if you're interested in my earlier books, they're all available on Amazon or through Headline Books. Drink to Every Beast, Amid Rage, and Strange Fire, and encourage you to take a look at those as well. But thank you very much, and thanks again to Kathy and Headline Books.
Okay, and thanks to our audience. Have a good day, everyone.